Now, how many of you saw on Wednesday this following article in The Sun? It said, "Science, Religion, Two Windows on the World." And Francis Ayala said, "There are different points of view, but they don't have to contradict each other." Any of you read this on Wednesday? This is my message also. That science and religion are two views of the world, but they don't have to contradict each other. For some people, they will, but for most people, they don't need to. And so the message that Francisco Alaya was talking about is going to be similar to the one I am going to be discussing. Now, as a biologist, I come at it from a different perspective. The reason I started this lecture is that for many years I was teaching fourth-year evolution at the University of the Fraser Valley. And I found that as I taught biology undergraduates, that many had a conflict between their religious views and what they were coming to hear in biology. And I would find students in first year, for example, I could see them sort of mentally crossing their arms and saying, "E-word, I am not going to listen to this because this is going to be a threat to me and my faith." And I found by fourth year, many students, conservative students, were seriously conflicted. They'd seen overwhelming evidence for evolution, and they felt that how were they going to reconcile this with their faith? And so I developed this lecture actually for my fourth-year evolution class. And I found that many students said, "Why didn't someone tell me this in first year? I wouldn't have worried about it all these years." So I started originally for students, and then as I started doing this in public, I found that many people, some people I talked to in public felt the same. They felt that if anyone had any sort of religious views, whatever, they obviously could not accept evidence for evolution, because I think there is a popular conception that accepting the evidence for evolution is equivalent to, or you must be an atheist. So it's partly to bring it up as a public discussion. I'm hoping that eventually to do this as a topic for teachers. And so it's something that I feel is quite important, because I think a very useful perspective on the world, which is that of the evolutionary perspective, which is found now a lot in medicine and agriculture, is something that people are shutting their eyes to just because they feel there could be a possible conflict. So my message then is that the relationship between evolution and creationism is a continuum. That is, there's a sliding scale between the two views. It's not just a dichotomy between two incompatible choices. So that's the first part. Second is that acceptance for the evidence of evolution can be compatible with religious faith. And there's a huge area in which this is the case. So my plan is to show you, or to discuss with you, this continuum that was developed by the Center for Science Education in the US, in which their director, Eugenie Scott, developed a continuum, as she put it, of all the different positions that there are on going from creationism, which is the most conservative position, is that the earth is flat, which is a very conservative position, and not too many people nowadays hold to that, but a few do, to what's called materialist evolutionism, or that's the position of people who are atheists and their position on evolution. So what I want to do is to go through the positions that I've underlined in red. There's really too much to do all of them. It's just not enough time. So I'm going to look at young earth creationism, which is quite alive and well in the Fraser Valley, and then intelligent design, which is you read a lot about in the newspapers and is a fairly popular or persuasive, if you like, point of view. Then to look at evolutionary creationism and theistic evolutionism, which is where I feel the two come together in a very satisfactory manner. Then look at agnostic and atheist evolution at the same time. So first what I want to do is tell you what Darwin's idea was about evolution, and then talk to you very briefly about the modern definition of evolution. Darwin said, it's descent from an original ancestor. That is, all of us in this room are descended from an original ancestor millions of years ago with modification, and the mechanism for this is natural selection. A more modern explanation is that evolution provides a scientific explanation for why there are so many different kinds of organisms on the earth. So that's one of the prime things. Second, how it is that all the organisms on earth are part of an evolutionary lineage, that is, related. then the key thing here, and one of the key things that Darwin established, was that they share a common ancestor. Evolution is the central organizing principle of biology. Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that is the perspective from which we pursue theories, we teach our classes, and people who work in the field, sort of that's what they hold to. Now, if it is true that all of us in this room and all organisms on Earth share a common ancestor, it means that 25% of human genes are the same as those of a banana. So the idea is, get over yourself. This is the message. Now, evolution, you most commonly hear about evolution as a theory. But it's also a fact. And I'd like to look at how we discuss theories in science and then compare it to how we discuss facts in science. So scientific theory is not the same as a hunch, which is the way that we use a theory. Oh, it's all very well in theory, but it doesn't really work very well in practice. So what it is a comprehensive explanation of observed phenomena of what we see in the natural world that's supported by a vast body of evidence. And when we look at a scientific theory, like the ones we have now, it summarizes the current state of knowledge about any given phenomenon. For example, atomic theory. What we know about atomic theory is summarized, and what we know about atoms, molecules, those sorts of things are summarized in the atomic theory. What we know about evolution is summarized in the evolutionary theory. Now, a fact is something that's a bit different. Now, I'm talking about a fact in scientific terms. So it's an observation that has been repeatedly confirmed by studies by independent scientists. So in other words, it's a phenomenon that has been observed so frequently that its existence is no longer questioned. Now, I'd like to do a scientific fact poll. So the poll is the following, and I want you to vote on this. So how many of you accept the pictures you've seen in books that the Earth goes around the sun and it does so in 1 year? Now vote if you agree with this. So the Earth goes around the sun and it takes a year to do so. Those of you who agree that that's the case, vote. Those of you who don't think that's the case. Now, how many of you here have actually seen it? Anybody here seen this? Yet you accept this as a fact. Why?
You see phenomena that tell you that there are certain repetitions within a yearly cycle, right? I mean,
okay.
The sun rises and
right.
sets at different times in different places.
True, but doesn't it sound like the sun is going around the Earth? Sun rising, setting, think of the way we talk about it. But yes, yearly phenomena, yes?
The geocentric model
right.
makes less sense than the convergent model.
Less sense, but intuitively, which one do you think makes more sense? We see the sun coming up. We're, as far as we can know, we're still, sun comes up, goes down, the moon comes up, etc., goes down. So all I'm saying is that even though we all in this room accept this as a fact, we have none of us seen it. How many here have seen an atom? Yes?
Scanning down the microscope.
Have you actually seen an atom?
The scanning down the microscope.
Okay, so it's technology bound. I guess some people would argue that what you're seeing is an artifact of what they interpret as an atom. So the question is, how many people here believe that there are such things as atoms? Okay, so I'm just bringing this up for a particular reason, because I have a secret agenda behind bringing this up. Because we think about the atom, okay? So here we are, the atom we just voted on, basic unit of matter that consists of central nucleus surrounded by a cloud of electrons. So that is a scientific fact, and everybody in this room, including myself, agrees that that is a scientific fact. Now, the atomic theory explains how matter is made of atoms. So there's a difference between a fact, which is an observation that has been repeatedly confirmed, so no one bothers to argue about it, and then the theory which explains it. So it's the same with the idea of evolution. Evolution is also a fact as well as being a theory. The evidence for evolution is so strong that it's considered to be a fact. Now, in the scientific community, then, there's nearly universal agreement that evolution is both a fact, that is, that it happened, and a theory, which is how it happened. Now, here's the part that you chemists aren't going to believe for a moment. That there is a consensus that there's better evidence for evolution than there is for the existence of atoms. Now, chemists immediately leap up and say, what? Impossible. But nonetheless, that is the consensus, that the evidence for evolution is stronger than the evidence for atoms. I want you to keep that in mind. Now, when we think about these facts as we've been thinking about them, is that when we look now at people's level of acceptance for evolution, you find quite a different thing. You look at now, a poll was done in 2005, and they went to a number of different countries, and people were asked to respond to the statement, human beings as we know them developed from earlier species of animals. So you can see that in Iceland, the acceptance of that, or the agreement with that, is over 80%. You look at Turkey, for example, it's under 30%. Now you look at our neighbor to the south, the US, it's at around 40%. Now I'll show you a bit of data shortly from Canada, where you'll see where Canada fits in this whole thing. Now if you were to ask these people about atoms, I would be prepared to bet that those who've had any sort of education, 100% of them would agree that there are such things as atoms. Now, one of the interesting things, this is data from the States, is when you look at the differences in religions, because what's going to come up during all of this discussion is the fact that different religious groups have got a different level of acceptance about evolution. Now, this was done in the US by the Pew Trust. And what they did then was to look at, they did a sampling of, it was quite a large sampling, where they found that if you look at the highest level of acceptance, that 81% is amongst Buddhists. And after that is Hindus, then the Jewish, this is non-conservative Jewish, generally. Unaffiliated groups, then you look at the Catholic Church, those who are Catholics, 58%. Orthodox, Catholic, 54%. Mennonite Protestant, 51%. Muslim, 45%. And then you get down, if you look, one group that is of interest to us is Evangelical Protestant. And Evangelical Protestant churches generally are young earth creationist groups, which I'm going to look at, in which they believe in biblical literalism. That is, that the Bible is the inspired word of God, and you take it as historical fact. But even amongst this group, you notice almost 25% still will accept the idea of evolution. And then the lowest are groups like Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. So the religion that you've been brought up in does indeed make a difference. Now, last year, as you may remember, was the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth, and it was also the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. So, of course, there was a huge flurry of activity. I'd set up a festival in the valley about Darwinism. We had Darwin's great-great-grandson, who lives in Abbotsford, came to one of our talks, various things. We had someone dressed up as Darwin who came. So we had, like many places, we had a celebration. As part of it, and as part of a big conference on evolution, World Conference of Science Journalists in London, they did a big study. 10,000 people were studied in this. So it was a huge study, the biggest that's ever been done. So as you see there, Argentina, China, Egypt, India, Mexico, Russia, South Africa, Spain, Great Britain, and the United States. Canada is never included in these surveys. I can tell you. I've looked for data on Canada. I don't know. I guess we're too polite, too mild. So when you look at the data, as you might expect, countries where there's a very high level of education, there was also a very high level of awareness. So in the USA and England, there was 71% awareness. Mexico and Argentina, it was 68 and 65. And those who hadn't heard of it were also countries in which there's a very low level of education, were South Africa and Egypt. Now, overall, when you looked at these, about 56% of those who'd heard of it accepted scientific evidence for the theory. Now, this is the interesting part. So you look at the highest levels of acceptance. India, 77%. China, 72%. Mexico, 65%. The UK, 62%. Spain and Argentina, sort of 61 and 57. So that percentage of the people polled accepted the theory of evolution as being scientifically founded. The lowest level of acceptance was in Russia at 48%, South Africa, US, and the lowest was Egypt. Now, the interesting thing when you look at this data and consider the data from Catholic countries, you find that acceptance of evolution in Catholic countries is actually very high. Higher than it is in the US, for example. So Mexico, 65%, Spain, 61%, Argentina, 57%. And what you find when you look at the education in those countries is that even though they are officially, I think, Catholic countries, what they teach in schools is just regular biological evolution. So it's not a barrier, for example, to teaching. Now, what would you guess is the level of support in Canada? This was an Angus Reid poll done in 2007, and this was the statement. So there's 3 statements. Human beings evolved from less advanced forms over millions of years. Then another statement was God created human beings in their present form in the last 10,000 years, and then not sure. Now, what would you guess is the percentage of people who agreed with the evolutionary perspective? Any suggestions? 45? 50? 70? 75? So it varies between the optimists and the pessimists of the group. Well, as we see, 59%. So Angus Reid triumphantly said, most Canadians pick evolution over creationism. Now, what was also done at the same time was something quite interesting, which is they asked the second question. Or one of the other questions was, it says, the Big Valley Creation Science Museum opened this month in Alberta. This is 2007. One of the museum's displays suggests that dinosaurs and human beings coexisted on Earth. Do you agree or disagree with this assertion? So what's your guess about that one? Those who agree with this. That means they take that human beings and dinosaurs lived at the same time. 20? 5? So this would mean that they feel that human beings and dinosaurs lived at the same time. 2. Oh, you optimists. Oh, I like it. Actually, 42% agree. So despite the fact that, they agree that human beings evolved from, earlier forms, there's a tad bit of confusion about what's involved in the evolution. Now, I think part of it is the fact that we see dinosaurs and human beings together all the time. So those of you who watch the Flintstones with your children or grandchildren, of course, dinosaurs are there. And as we know, we see them all the time. So if we look at Canada and how they are on the world scale of things, you'll see that Canada is certainly higher than the US, but somewhere between Poland and Croatia. Below Italy and Ireland. So, so I think, as myself, of course, as an evolutionist and someone who teaches evolution, I'm very interested and concerned about this, but nonetheless, it's a very interesting finding. And I think that we are influenced a lot by the press from the US, so I think that that's a big factor as well. So I'd like to begin what I'm thinking of as the whirlwind tour by looking at young Earth creationism. So if we look at these people, I forgot, right. Today, at the same time as our talk today, those of us who all voted that we go around the sun, there's a conference in Indiana going on right this very moment. It says Galileo was wrong, the church was right. Today from 8:30 to 10:30 tonight. For example, geocentrism, they know it, but they're hiding it. Scientific experiments showing Earth motionless in space. Scientific evidence, Earth in the center of the universe. Galileo and the church, what really happened. So, there you are. carbon and radiometric dating showing a young Earth. So geocentrism is alive and well in some places. But we look at young Earth creationism. As I say, it's a fairly strong movement, particularly in the Valley. It's not a huge movement, but nonetheless, what I wanted to talk to you about are some of the precepts, some of the religious precepts, then some of the geological and biological precepts, and then some of the cultural aspects of this that I think are very important. So first of all, when we look at the basis for this, is that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God. That means inerrant is that there are no mistakes in it, and it can be interpreted as an historical document. That is, every word has been inspired by God and is to be taken literally. So this is a literalist tradition. Now it accepts heliocentrism that we all voted on here today, that is that the Earth goes around the sun, but it rejects the conclusions of modern physics, astronomy, chemistry, geology concerning the age of the Earth and the age of the universe. Now, the feeling in this group is that the Earth and the universe are about 6,000 years old, and this was due to a calculation by Bishop Ussher during Victorian times, but some are willing to accept that it's a bit older, maybe 10,000, perhaps 12,000 years old. And when you look at the geological record, that is how the rocks are laid down, this was all due to Noah's flood. So Noah's flood was responsible for carving the Grand Canyon and all other geological features like mountains and the layering we see in the Earth. These kinds of things are all due to Noah's flood. And when you look at the layering of the fossil strata, that is how they're organized in the Earth's crust, that is an artifact of Noah's flood waters withdrawing. So it's the reason that they're organized the way they are, with more what we would think of as more recent animals on top and earlier animals down below, is an artifact of the floodwaters and when they withdrew. Now there's a very important cultural component to this, which I think is why people are very strong when they hold to this position. So one of the key beliefs about young Earth creationists is that cultural acceptance of geological history, that is, that the Earth is millions of years old, or that life on Earth is millions of years old, they feel that this was a significant step towards rejecting biblical authority and accepting evolutionary ideas. So as you'll see, is that this is kind of a cultural feeling, and that's a very strong reason for them to hold to it. Now, when you look at it from the biological perspective, firstly, they reject biological descent with modification. That is, the fact that they would reject the idea that reptiles could have evolved from earlier amphibian forms, so that amphibians could have evolved from fish, for example. And so this rejects the theory that earlier forms of life are ancestral to later ones. Because the idea is that there was a special creation that took 6 24-hour days. We know the days of creation are written as 6 24-hour days. That's how it is interpreted in this. And what was created were what are called baramins. That is, these are the kinds of organisms were created on those days. And these kinds, these baramins, had so much genetic variation in them, in modern terms that is, that that all of the modern forms that we see on Earth could evolve from them. So they will now accept microevolution, that is, small amounts of evolution. So, for example, the cat family, or the cat baramin, was created on the day that animals were created. And now what's happened since then is we now have microevolution, so we have lions, tigers, domestic cats, cougars, these kinds of things have all come from this basic cat baramin that was created on that one day. Now, when we consider the origin of humans, Adam and Eve are humanity's original ancestors, created in the image of God, and they share no ancestry or relationship with any other form of life. Now, that was the original couple that were created. There are some ideas that perhaps they were representatives of the first humans, but then Noah's flood came along in what's stated to be about 2500 BC, and it wiped out all human beings except for 8. So all human beings that are alive today are the descendants of those 8, because they were the ones that were left to found the human race. Now, if we look at who holds to this version of creationism. Generally, it's evangelical Christian groups, very conservative Islamic and Jewish groups, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, these are all young earth creationists. And if you're interested in looking at their material, it can be accessed at creationbc.org. So there's a website you can go to. And the most well-known website is called Answers in Genesis. Answers in Genesis, the point or the goal of this website is to refute all of the scientific literature that's come out on evolution in layman's terms. So it's very interesting to read. And so there's a lot you can see in there. And as you'll see with one of the main movers in this, someone called Ken Ham, said, "The battle is not one of young Earth versus old Earth, or billions of years versus 6 days, or creation versus evolution. The real battle is the authority of the Word of God versus man's fallible opinions." So the cultural aspects of this are more important to them, and this is what drives all of the acceptance of all of these other ideas, is because what's more important is the authority of God versus the authority of man. And so underlying all of this, all of these arguments, is this very strong religious and cultural idea. Now, I'm not going to spend any time looking at what these between young earth creationism and what's called gap creationism, day-age creationism, and progressive creationism. Those are all creationist ideas that were very popular or well received in Victorian times. And the idea there was so much geological evidence was coming up during that time. They were finding out so much about the age of the Earth, fossils, that people quite willingly accepted the idea that the Earth was millions of years old. So this was sort of a creationist idea in that the day, if we think about the day-age creationism, it was quite an acceptable idea during Victorian times that a day was not 24 hours long. The day could have been millions of years, so that as a result, each of these days took a place for a very long period of time. But when young Earth creationism sort of moved into the popular consciousness sort of in the 60s, a lot of people were very comfortable with that idea. And even though their church might have been a church that accepted that the day of creation was millions of years old, then this idea of the young earth creationism became more popular. So as a result, young earth creationism now is the main, I'd say the main theory, if you like, with creationist groups. But intelligent design is something that gets a lot of press. I want to talk about it from two perspectives. One, what is the theory, that is the explanatory theory of intelligent design? And then secondly, about the intelligent design movement, because that's what you see mostly in the press. So there's an intelligent design movement. I'd like to look at some of its goals. Then I'd like to have a look at the wedge document, which is not very well known, but it's available online. They're not hiding it, they just don't talk about it much. So first of all, when we think about intelligent design, what I'm calling ID, it's what is sometimes called a big tent. That is, it's a big tent in that it accepts people of different persuasions. As long as they are anti-evolutionist, they're welcome in the big tent of intelligent design. So it's various perspectives. Some are young earth creationists, some are what you would think would be quite advanced or well-educated, if you like, in biology creationist perspectives. But as long as they're anti-evolutionist or anti-Darwinist, then they sometimes come together under this intelligent design movement. Now, what intelligent design does, it accepts geological evidence for an ancient Earth. So that's one thing. It also accepts natural selection, but not natural selection and mutation as being random events that just occur in a naturalistic setting. Nor do they feel that mutation and natural selection are enough to explain the complexity of life that we see now on Earth. Instead, they feel that DNA, or first is that DNA is too complex, You could not get to DNA through any kind of natural process. Then also that mutations are not random, but directed towards some sort of improvement. A big tenet and a big talking point for them is they feel that major anatomical body types, that is the difference between mammals, fish, human beings, invertebrates, these kinds of major body forms, and the origin of life itself are viewed as being too complex. They could not have happened naturally. So as a result, they propose an intelligent designer. Often they're silent on who the intelligent designer is, but it's quite obvious that since they're mainly Christian groups, that the intelligent designer is God. Now, scientifically, what intelligent design says, people who work in this, they say that you can find proof or confirmation of guided design in natural life forms. So they say there should be positive evidence of intelligent design in living systems that can be tested for and evaluated using scientific methods. This is a big part of what they propose. There's several quite famous books. You may have seen Darwin's Black Box, which is one that was written. Darwin on Trial was another very famous book. These came out, Darwin on Trial came out about 18 years ago. Darwin's Black Box about 15 years ago. And they put forward the ideas, they're scientific ideas, that you can find proof of positive design or of active design in the natural world. That's the one thing. And that secondly, that you can find proof that things like the eye, for example, are too complex to evolve on their own or naturally. However, no scientific predictions have ever been tested using this methodology. It hasn't published any original research papers that test these hypotheses either in their own journals, in scientifically reviewed journals, or anywhere. Now we come to a cultural belief of theirs. And this is one of the things that underpins all of what they do. And this is that cultural acceptance of Darwinism, or what they call materialism, that is science, is a major force of moral decay in American society. So if they can undermine or discredit Darwinism, then it will reverse these cultural effects. So again, keep in mind that this is a key belief, and it drives a lot of the other things that they do. So if you look for the goals that are driven by this key belief, you look for them in the Wedge document, which was published in 1998. It was published by the Discovery Institute, which is a large, very well-funded institute in Seattle, Washington. So firstly, they want to defeat scientific materialism, that is regular science, and its destructive moral, cultural, and political legacies. They want to replace materialistic explanations, that is scientific explanations, with a theistic understanding that nature and human beings are created by God. They want to see intelligent design theory as the predominant perspective in science. They want to see design theory, that is intelligent design theory, permeate religious, cultural, moral, and political life. Even though they propose that intelligent design is a scientific theory, they have not published any research papers. And their own journal that ran for a couple of years has ceased publication because they just were unable to find any research that supported their perspective. So instead what they've done is to refocus their efforts, and they've taken it into the public forum instead. One of the things they do is to reinterpret scientific work. It's called the yes but approach to research. A research paper comes out showing that, something like a mutation, for example, that's caused a major change in a life form. And the response is yes, but, and then they come up with a series of objections. So they have no original research of their own, but they object to papers as they come out and offer a different interpretation. They also attempt to win popular support, particularly amongst evangelical organizations. They assert that evolution is only acceptable if you are an atheist. It's another major cultural talking point. The other thing they claim, and this is one of their very strong arguments, is that there's significant controversy and disagreement in the scientific community about the validity of evolution. For example, they came out with a document 2001, it was called A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism, in which 700 scientists had signed up to this document to say that they disbelieved the evidence for evolution. Now, someone estimated that this was about 0.2% of scientists in the United States. But they put forward this document as being very strong evidence that there was a huge amount of controversy within the scientific community. Now, the other thing that they do, and you hear this quite a lot, is they want schools to teach the controversy. The controversy that is really pretty much non-existent, but by coming out with these documents saying that, oh, lots of scientists, wouldn't give 2 moments for evolution, where in fact it's a very, very tiny percentage of folks. In fact, less than 0.25% of scientists believe in creationism, either young earth creationism or intelligent design. So that means that 99.75% of scientists in all disciplines, whether in physics, astronomy, whatever it is, accept the evidence for evolution just as they accept the evidence for atomic theory. So to scientists, there's really no difference in the two. The next stage that I want to look at is theistic evolutionism, where I think is the main place where people come together, people of faith who also accept the evidence for evolution. And this is an area I think that is mostly unexplored, or that many people don't know exists. So the idea here is that if we look at the key beliefs of people who are theistic evolutionists, again, these are non-literalists. These are people who accept that holy books are inspired, authoritative Word of God. And a few will say, well, it's also every word is to be accepted as fact rather than as a metaphor or as culturally interpreted. They accept that the interpretation of Genesis can fit with the old Earth, that is, the Earth being 4.65 billion years old and the cosmos being older yet. And that the interpretation of Genesis' account can fit with evolutionary biology by understanding the context in which it was written, by understanding the purposes for which it was written, and the original intended audience of that text, and not trying to make the claim that it's applicable with the identical wording for an audience today. Also, the idea that humans are created in the image of God, they share ancestry with other forms of life, and that these views are not in conflict. What I'd like to do is to go to look at the most conservative of these groups and then move to perhaps what are considered to be the most liberal, or the ones that have got what's called a deist perspective. But first I'd like to look at what they feel in a biological sense. That is, so it's the idea then that God creates through the laws of nature. And one of the laws of nature, one of the ways that the natural world operates, is through evolution. Accept all the findings of modern science, including the Big Bang, accept random mutation, accept Darwin's descent with modification through natural selection. And I would say, so this is the view of academics from all of these religious groups, I'd say. Now, I did say biologists, but in fact, I would say this is true of scientists who have faith-based views, is that this would be what's generally accepted. And when they approach to doing science in their labs or doing science in the field, they use what are called scientific methodologies, which I just want to introduce you to briefly, because they're going to be very important when we're looking at some of the aspects at the end. So it's exactly what is a method of someone who's involved in science. It's just that it's the things you read about or you heard about in school, that it uses hypothesis, prediction, testing, repeating, and then eventually you end up with a theory at the end of that, an explanatory theory. Then the theories that you're using give rise to hypotheses that you then test using these scientific methodologies. For example, heliocentric theory that Galileo and Copernicus were talking about gave you different hypotheses and predictions than, say, did a geocentric theory. And the geocentric theory was overturned because the predictions and the observations that people made better fit the idea that the Earth went around the Sun than the Sun went around the Earth. Now, scientists take the position that it's the only effective way to investigate reality. It's practical and it's useful only when it deals with natural causes. Now, an important thing here is that it does not and cannot investigate or theorize about supernatural causes. When you talk to a theistic evolutionist, they would agree that science really can only investigate the natural world, and they mostly agree on the science of evolutionary theory. There are not absolutely everything, but their position on God and the role of God, they would agree, is a matter of faith. And interestingly enough, this is also the view of many atheists. And you'll see when we get to that point. Now, I'd like to take a look at the most conservative one first, which is looking at some evangelical Christian groups. This is the U.S. data mostly. Now, when you look at evangelical Christian biologists, and if you look at the proportion of people, if you remember the evangelicals who held with evolution, I would bet the biologists are in that group. What they're trying to do is to bring a scientific perspective to their church's understanding of evolution. So some of my colleagues are evangelical evolutionists, and they are trying to work with their churches to bring a more nuanced understanding of evolution. So that's one end. So there are some biologists who are working on it. There are also biblical scholars who are trying to work with their churches, and again, to look for a more modern interpretation of the language. For example, a day in the Bible is used in many different ways in other sections of Genesis. So the argument that they make is that a day need not signify 24 hours because the day, the same word, is used in a different way in other parts of Genesis. So why must you insist that in the part concerning creation it must mean 24 hours? Francis Collins is a very well-known scientist in the U.S., and in fact, he's a practicing evangelical Christian. He was the director of the Human Genome Project, and so he worked on that for many years. So when the Human Genome was announced in 2005, he was one of the people who had been directing the efforts, and he's now the director of the U.S. National Institutes of Health. So he's a very highly regarded scientist, and he wrote a very interesting book called The Language of God. A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. And he is someone who works on genomes. But he's also a theistic evolutionist. So he holds with all aspects of biological evolution. There are also some religions that don't say that the Bible has to be strictly interpreted in all portions, that instead, what they feel is that God intervenes at critical periods during the history of life, and this critical period is with the origin of humans. And this is the position of the Catholic Church and the position of some Islamic groups. So evolution proceeds as we would expect, but God intervenes for the production of the human soul. They agree that humans are descended from more primitive forms, but that the intervention of God brought about humans as we know them. What's interesting is that popes have endorsed this view from time to time. So, for example, Pope John Paul said at a conference, "Today, more than half a century after the appearance of the encyclical," this was Pope Pius XII in 1950, "some new findings lead us toward the recognition of evolution as more than an hypothesis. In fact, it is remarkable that this theory has had progressively greater influence on the spirit of researchers following a series of discoveries in different scholarly disciplines. The convergence in the results of these independent studies, which was neither planned nor sought, constitutes in itself a significant argument in favor of the theory." So this was a message of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences on October 22nd, 1996. But if you remember, the survey on Catholics in the U.S., only about 56% accepted evolution. Yet the official position of the Church is that they accept evolution. As I mentioned, Catholic schools teach scientific biological evolution in their classrooms, as do Catholic universities. If we look at what's called liberal theology, in these kinds of churches, there the position is, again, moving a bit towards the liberal side, is that it's inappropriate to use Genesis as a scientific text, since it was written in a pre-scientific age, and it was originally intended for religious instruction. So theistic evolutionists don't believe that creation was a week long. But what's different is that it's an ongoing process. It started with Genesis, but it's continuing through time, and it's continuing on today. So the idea then here is that this view affirms that God created the world and was the primary cause of the creation of the universe. But biological evolution is part of what's called creatio continua, or that's continuing creation, which is still occurring. Now, this is the position of most contemporary Protestant churches: Anglicans, United, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, etc., and many other religions as well. 12th of February 2006 was Evolution Sunday. So the 197th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth was commemorated by Evolution Sunday. Now the message was in churches that followers of Christ do not have to choose between biblical stories of creation and evolution. And this was taught in classes and sermons in many churches in the USA on that day. This is the farthest, the most liberal of all of the theistic evolution stances. This is what's called Deism. The idea that God created the universe, and as part of doing that, he created the laws of nature, and in more conservative views of this, he was also involved in creating life. Then after that, biological evolution occurred, and it's still occurring without further guidance. Now, a step beyond that is that God created the universe and the laws of nature, and that was it. After that, it was hands off, and everything that has happened to the world since then has occurred without further divine intervention. And that's sort of the furthest of what's called the deistic responses. Now, I just want to bring up science again, and the last sentence here is that science is not effective when it deals with or theorizes about supernatural causes. So that's a position that I hold as a scientist, and many other scientists do as well. Now, there are some scientists who go a step further, and they assert that the natural world is all that exists, whereas my position is that science, all it can do is investigate the natural world, and because of the methods of science, it cannot make any kinds of investigations about the supernatural. It's just not set up to do that. But some scientists would go further and say that the natural world, and in fact the universe, is all that exists, and therefore nothing that's supernatural exists. Now, it's the position of theistic and agnostic evolutionism that science cannot and does not investigate or theorize about supernatural causes. The difference is where the matter of faith, whether you're on the faith that you feel that God was behind it, or that you can't tell, in which case you're an agnostic, say there's no evidence one way or another. But then a step further than that is to say that atheistic evolutionism is that you feel that that the natural world is all that exists. But the agnostic and atheistic evolutionism positions are actually very similar. These are the last two in this continuum. So as you know, agnostics believe it's impossible to know whether there is a God, and that agnostics who do science using these scientific methodologies that I talked about, and that it limits a scientist, such as myself, for example, to explain natural phenomena that are involved in natural causes, and that's really all that science can do. So in this view, the question of whether or not supernatural agents are involved in evolution is untestable. And if it's untestable, it's not a subject for investigation. You just can't do anything useful in investigation, and so you would not do so. So agnostics hold that one cannot logically determine whether there's a God, nor detect any influences in the world. So they would assert that there's no evidence for God, the role of God in evolution, but then again, nor is there any evidence against the role of God in evolution. So, the t-shirt I want to get, Viva la Evolution. Go one step further, and here we look at atheistic evolution, and here they reject the involvement of God, or assert there's no evidence for the role of God, but have gone that one step further and say that the world as we know it and the universe as we know it is all there is. Now, however, most would agree that there are many valid positions amongst those who accept evidence for evolution. That you can be a theistic evolutionist, you can be an atheistic evolutionist or agnostic. And that really what's important is that you accept the evidence for evolution. And what's interesting is that Richard Dawkins, who has always been regarded as the most fervent of the atheistic evolutionists, has softened his stance in the last few years because he realized, as he said, the data are against me. He said, here I have got a lot of colleagues who are theistic evolutionists or agnostic evolutionists. He said, it's obvious that studying evolution does not necessarily lead you to atheism. So finally he accepted the data and he said, well, if that's true, he said, what's more important? And he felt it's more important for those of us who are evolutionists to be working together, whether they're theistic evolutionists or agnostics or atheists, than it is to insist that everybody who studies evolution must be an atheist. People like myself, for example, wrote to Richard Dawkins, and I think people who are involved in instructing undergraduates saying, your position is making it very difficult for me to reach a broad audience of students, because students come in thinking, if I'm going to accept evolution, that's it. I'm going to become an atheist, or I must be an atheist. And it made it much more difficult for me as an instructor of undergraduates than if he'd taken the position that he does now, which is that what counts here is that you accept the evidence for evolution. Now, some, however, do, and Dawkins does assert that he thinks that the acceptance of the evidence for evolutionary theory should logically lead to evolution, to atheism, Now, of course, these are the kind of people who get newspapers because they assert that it does. But even so, if you look at what they say, Dawkins particularly and some people who've been speaking lately have been very careful as to how they couch it. So, for example, someone like Dawkins, he might say that God wasn't necessarily involved in evolution or the creation of the universe. The newspapers say scientists reject the role for God. Even though what he said is, well, in my view, it's not necessary. Now, I'd like to let Stephen Hawking have the last word on this, because he has said some things that, of course, caused great excitement in the press, and he's indicated some of the problems you have with interpretation by the press. So Stephen Hawking said, if you remember this book, A Brief History of Time, his final paragraph said the following. He said, however, if we discover a complete theory, that is a theory of everything, which is what physicists want, it should in time be understandable by everyone, not just a few scientists. Then we shall all, philosophers, scientists, and just ordinary people, be able to take part in the discussion of why it is that we and the universe exist. If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we should know the mind of God. Now that statement, of course, if we find the answer to that, it'll be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we should know the mind of God. Of course, caused a lot of excitement in newspapers. They all said, Stephen Hawking says God was involved in the creation of the universe. He said, in the proof stage, I nearly cut that last sentence out of the book. Had I done so, the sales of the book might have been halved. Now, Stephen Hawking was in the news again. Just this year, he and Leonard Mlodinow published a book called The Grand Design. And there are 4 statements that I'm going to read to you, the first of which says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. And here's this statement again. It's not necessary to invoke God to light what he calls the blue touch paper and set the universe going. That night on CNN News, Stephen Hawking, God didn't create the universe. So even now when atheists are trying to be more careful about how they use this word and use necessarily, and in fact Dawkins himself has said in some of his writings lately, he said, for me as an atheist to go the step further and say, I know there is no God, he said, is an act of faith. He said, because I have no way of knowing one way or the other. He said, for me, the universe and the world proclaims to me that there is no God. But he realizes that that is an act of faith because science is an area that science cannot investigate. So finally, Here are two Galapagos tortoises talking and saying, since that young Darwin was here, their species certainly has evolved. So now's the time for questions and discussion.